All right, Joelle, you ready to do this?
I'm ready.
All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here with my guest, Joelle Rabow Maletis. Joelle, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. So Joelle's passion is helping clients develop through self-discovery and post-trauma growth. As a well-known psychotherapist, clinical supervisor, and CEO, Joelle uses reflective listening, strategic inquiry, and encouragement to provide feedback and interaction that allows clients to make informed, healthy, and compassionate decisions. Her career highlights include a feature on TED Talks. She's been an executive coach for Apple, Google, Netflix, Zoom, and other Silicon Valley executives. She's also a psychology professor at major universities, a guest speaker on ABC's 60 Minutes. You are busy. She holds a Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology, specializing in trauma, and a Master of Fine Arts in Dance, as well as other incredible things that are,
Thank you.
We'll link it up on her bio. But my gosh, thanks for being here. Before we get going, Joelle, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
So I'm originally from Cupertino, California, which is now, the home of big tech. And I have a practice in Mountain View, which is about 10 minutes down the street. So I'm in the area that I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in California.
Okay, awesome. So, as I said before we started here today, I'm interested in you and your journey and how the heck did you get interested in this field? Seriously, it's amazing and it's inspiring at the same time. Go.
Thank you. Yeah. I joke and say, the 2-second elevator pitch is a dart at a dartboard. And there's a little bit of truth to that. This is my second career. I'm a retired ballerina by training, and we'll talk about how that plays into trauma and my work with trauma. And I found myself in Silicon Valley with a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, newly divorced, running a dance department, and went, okay, now what do I do? I had, finished, close to finishing a PhD in something else, and the economy was good, and I was in and out of therapy for my own trauma. Had a terrible marriage and family therapist, and kind of said, well, I never want anybody to have to go through that again. And this sounds like a good career. I had no background in psychology. I hadn't even had a psych class since I did my undergrad in political science. Like, I was just so ill-equipped for it. And 3 weeks later, I'm in a private school in a program full time. And
when was this?
So this was in 2004.
Okay.
And and just went, all right, let's see if this works. And I joke and say, really, we go to psych school to heal ourselves. Right. And I think for me that was completely true. I loved my therapist and the work that we were doing. And I was fascinated with people and relationships and movement and how the body holds trauma, but had no idea what that actually look like. So I really fell into this career, all pun intended, and had no idea, and ended up loving it.
All right. So, wow, a lot of transitions there. You get into psychology, and how do things evolve such that you become interested in trauma?
Yeah. So I think I started off being interested in somatic. How the body holds memory and body processing, with my background as a dancer. I have a master's in education and a master's in fine arts dance. And so I was really interested, right? I was really interested in okay, how do we experience the world through movement, and thought that's what I want to do. I want to be a dance movement therapist, and took one class in it and went, nope, way too triggering. And that was the first aha moment of, there's got to be something there for me, if I can't even sit with it.
Hold on a second. So way too triggering. Say a little more about that.
Yeah. So being in my body and completely vulnerable and authentic in the therapeutic space, was too triggering for my own trauma. And I hadn't done the work yet. And so there was something in that moment of, this is terrifying and magical all at the same time. And so for me, it was being in my body as Joelle was excruciating. Being in my body as whatever role I was hired to play, oh, well, that's easy. That's just a mask I get to put on. And so I can pretend and be fully comfortable in my body without ever having to be me. And so I went, that was the first shift of saying, okay, well, there's something there about somatic, but maybe movement therapy isn't it. There's something more for me there.
How long were you dancing as a ballerina?
I danced 22 years professionally.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Where, in what capacity?
So I was a ballerina in my training and did that. And I joke and say I was okay at it. I was good enough to get to a place where my, father finally said, go to school, go to New York, go to LA, go do something. But these 3-month ballet contracts aren't going to pay the bills. And so I went from that and transitioned into ballroom, Latin dance, and then doing film and commercial work. So I spent most of my time doing on camera work, which again, which I loved, because I didn't have to live my life, right? I got to live all of these exciting characters. And yeah.
Okay. So a couple things here. You're interested in somatics. I love what you said about it being terrifying and magical. Obviously there's so much energy there.
Yeah.
And potential there. So how do things unfold for you?
So, fast forward, I was in a 3-year master's program, which is not necessarily the norm anymore. So I had an extra year of training in working with trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder specifically. And my dissertation was broad spectrum eating disorders, trauma, and PTSD. So remember, I'm a ballerina. We can draw the dots here.
Yeah.
And that's really what I thought. I thought I want to work with dancers and athletes. I want to work with people with trauma and eating disorders. There was a connection there for me personally and professionally in the work that I was doing. So I started off working with working in inpatient, working in eating disorder recovery clinics, and working with PTSD, and working from a multimodality approach. So skills-based, solution-focused DBT, and then bringing in some of that somatic. So that's where I started.
Okay. So earlier on in the interview, you said you hadn't done the work yet, your own work yet. When and how does that come into play here?
So it starts before I decided, hey, I want to, do the therapy thing as a job, right? And so, and then I kept doing my own individual therapy. And so as I was training and doing more training and had amazing exposure to Van der Kolk and Peter Levine and some of these original people that were working with somatic and getting to be at live lectures and watching these things. I started doing more of that kind of work in addition to traditional talk therapy and skills-based therapy. So I was in therapy and doing my own work extensively while I was also learning to be a therapist. And for me, that was the bridge where I found that either I was triggered in my own body and I didn't understand it. And so doing that somatic processing and then later doing EMDR as a client helped me start to bridge those gaps of, oh, okay, I think I can understand how to heal my own stuff, but also how do I show up in the room as a therapist who has trauma, who has to really hold those boundaries with the transference, countertransference pieces. And then also be there in a way that I can somatically and emotionally support my clients. And it was mind-blowing and amazing for me to be in the work and then also to be doing the work at the same time.
I would imagine that early on, and maybe even recently, maybe for a lot of people, there were some challenges.
Yeah.
Let's talk about one of those, if you can.
Yeah. I think now, and I have an amazing team. I get to be the clinical supervisor for a lot of people that are out of school recently and toward licensure. And I find that it's that, where do I start and stop as the therapist, and where does the client start and stop?
Hmm.
And that was the hardest thing to learn. I wanted to be Rogers all the time. I wanted to just have this sense of warm empathy, invitingness, that I'll be your best friend, and learning that that's actually not necessarily good therapy. And
Mhm.
so in the beginning, that was the hardest challenge. Was there were so many times where I'd sit with clients and I'd go, oh well, me too, oh well, me too, in my head,
Mhm.
right?
Oh, in your head,
And
okay.
yeah, and having that dialogue in my head, and then going into supervision and going into individual therapy and saying, how how do I control that process, so
Mhm.
I'm there for the client, because it isn't about me in that moment. But I really do feel like the universe even still brings me clients where they highlight things that I still need to work on.
Mhm. Interesting. So how did you, what did you do? How did you learn to kind of navigate those waters in a sense?
Yeah, so part of it is having really good clinical supervisors. I had some amazing ones. I had some not so amazing ones. I have a therapist that I still see, and we joke, even though she's fired me a few times. um, I still see her as I need to, and so for me, it was really sitting in session, noticing what was going on in my body, and then having the somatic training as a trainee and an intern and now associate, right?
Mhm.
Um, of what does that mean for the client? And it's like, oh, well, if you feel heavy, then I wonder if your client feels heavy. So learning really how to ask questions based on what I was experiencing somatically, and turning that into some Socratic questioning. So really learning how to use that transference countertransference component in the room, and then going into my individual therapy and saying, this was really hard for me. The client brought in X, Y, and Z, and that reminds me of my own story. And so there's stuff now that I notice that's coming up for me that I really need to process.
Mhm. All right. So just as a reminder, I'm speaking with Joelle Maletis. Now, your website is Joelle Rabow Maletis, JoelleRabowMaletis.com. We'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. When did you start this business, and how did that come about?
Yeah, so I started working in the world of trauma in 2008, started the business in 2011. And at the time, so from the time we're talking about until 2011, I really made the switch into being solely trauma focused, trauma informed. I began doing a lot of work with PTSD and post-traumatic growth, and then really became an expert in the field, and fell into working with first responders, refugees, immigrants, military, law enforcement. And in the Bay Area, that's a really interesting cross section, because so many people identify as all with all different descriptors, and
Mm-hmm.
the intersection of what they do for work, their trauma, and how they identify. And so 2011 really started my journey of becoming a trauma expert.
Why did you want to start the business?
You know, um, it's I had two little ones still, and I wanted to be a mom full time. And so when they were with their father, we we co-parented well. And so when they were with their dad, I worked long hours. And when they were with me, I did paperwork, and then I got to be mom. And so it gave me the flexibility, and I was very blessed to be able to do that. To start. So it really started with just, how do I be mom full time and do something that I love? I didn't retire from dancing until 2013. So I was still mom full time,
Wow.
working as a therapist full time, and still teaching dance. And then I finally was able to make that transition in 2013. It took me a little time to let it go.
What do you think it is about you, Joelle, and your experience, and your experience, period, that allows you to do this work, that has pulled you into the specialization of trauma?
I don't believe that good, with air quotes, good therapists have to experience what their clients experience. I think that there's some pluses and minuses to that. There was something for me personally about, if I can do it, if I can do the work, if I can work through my PTSD, if I can start to heal using all of these different techniques, then other people can too. And so it was something that there for me about giving back and being able to provide that healing experience that I had in therapy and still have in therapy. And so I think for me, that was the driving force of being able to say, it's so hard. The work is so hard to do, and it's painful, and it's exciting, and it's life-changing, and like I said, magical. It's all of those things all the time. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a deterrent. So that was really the piece that was fundamentally important, and why I kept the business going and have built the business now, was, can we bring therapy work to people that need it most, and make that accessible for people.
And how are you doing that, or trying to do that?
Yeah, so some of it is getting to be guests on podcasts like yours. Thank you for having me, and just bringing awareness to trauma-informed therapy, and really telling people that are listening and potential clients that there are really good therapists out there. And if you've had a bad experience in therapy, please don't quit. Find someone else, right? It's really about the connection of and the relationship that one makes with their therapist. And so, interview people, find the person that makes sense for you as a client, because therapy works. And so I think for me, it's really trying to bring that message and explaining what trauma-informed therapy looks like. Trying to do, so I do work with a lot of training with military and first responders at this point, police reform, and really working on how we work with people who are severely mentally ill in these environments, but also how we provide resiliency training, trauma training to people that are dealing with trauma on a day-to-day basis, and looking at suicide prevention. So that's the work that I'm doing these days.
So working with law enforcement and first responders, for those listeners who maybe haven't done that, what would you say? Give us just an overview of what it's like working with that population. And of course, we're generalizing here, but
yeah,
I'm going to ask you to do that anyway.
Yeah. It's been a very interesting journey. I like I said, I started to do that work in 2011, and it's changed over the last decade. I think some of it is really the psychoeducation for people to understand post-traumatic stress and stress related to trauma, whether that's witness trauma, that's experience-based trauma, vicarious trauma. So looking at how trauma affects us holistically, mind, body, and spirit. And of course, that's going to be stressful. And so this idea of post-traumatic stress makes sense. Our bodies react a certain way, our minds react a certain way. We hold these experiences in our relationships a certain way. And why wouldn't we if we're dealing with trauma on a day-to-day basis? Different than disordered, when we say, okay, this is affecting my daily life and living. And so for me, it started with really the psychoeducation of course, your job is traumatic and it's stressful. So let's talk about how we can do things to mitigate some of those stressors and to start healing before we move into post-traumatic stress disorder and looking at post-traumatic growth of, okay, and so what? Not, and so what, who cares? It's not unimportant, right? And so what does that mean for you, right? You as the individual experiencing trauma. And so that's primarily the work. That's where I start the work, is really giving some very clear working definitions, because I think destigmatizing PTSD and trauma, I'm very interested in stories over stigma. So really taking out that stigma and saying, going to therapy doesn't have to be because someone has severe mental illness. It can be short term, it can be supportive, right? It can be all of these things. It can be for self-growth, right? And so really making it accessible for populations that kind of push back and say, I don't need to go to therapy, I'm fine.
Right. It's funny, as you were talking, how naturally you're thinking about what you might ask. You addressed exactly what I was going to say on the stigma part, and also what you just said about working with these populations who push back, because for me, it's so interesting. All those populations obviously experience, there's a lot of trauma in the field, and yet it's not uncommon for a lot of people in those positions to push back. My brother was in the military, and it's like, no, I don't have PTSD. And of course he did. But are you seeing, right now in this time in which we're living, it feels like, sports figures are coming out and talking about their experiences of trauma. Are you seeing any shift as far as a destigmatization going on in those populations?
Yeah, we're talking about ideological change, right? And so it takes such a long time. And the more military, police officers, doctors, ICU nurses in COVID for the last few years, sports figures, the more people are coming out where society looks at these particular people in these professions as more, higher on the food chain, maybe, right? They're able to start breaking through some of that. I think there's some generational, at least in my experience in research, there's generational divides. And so what we see is people that are 25 and younger are hyperbolic in the way that they use diagnostic terms. Oh, I'm so depressed. Oh, she's bipolar. Oh, he's suicide. They're more willing to gravitate towards psychology. They want to talk about how they feel. They're digital natives, right? And they're used to getting information and sharing information. So I think some of it's generational, where we, when we look at people who are, I would say 40 and over, maybe 35 and over, they tend to say therapy means I'm broken. If I admit that I have trauma or post-traumatic stress in what I do, we see this a lot with 911 dispatchers. If I admit that I'm experiencing some vicarious trauma through what I'm doing, it means that I'm broken, right? And if I'm broken, I can't do my job. Right. And then there's going to be systemic or administrative consequences. And so really kind of bumping up against that, of saying, again, of course, what you're experiencing is traumatic. That doesn't mean that you'll ever develop PTSD. Some people do, and some people don't, right? And we're starting to understand more of what those precursors are, but we still don't have the answer for that.
Mhm.
And so what we do know is early intervention and therapy, right, work. And and so bringing it to people in that way of saying, look, you go to the doctor once a year for your physical, right? How about let's look at this as coaching or trauma coaching.
Right.
How do I do my job better? How do I manage my stressors and the traumas better? How do I have better relationships, instead of looking at it with, oh, well, of course you have PTSD. And then that's where that ideological challenge comes in.
Okay. Appreciate that. All right. So as we kind of wind down here, what's coming up for you in terms of you and your business, and what would you like our listeners to know about the services you provide?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for asking. So we are licensed in several different states. And so we do, we work with clients all the time. I've, like I said, a great trauma-informed team. And then for me, I'm getting to co-host a couple of YouTube live programs with a company, Switch Research, out of British Columbia in Canada. That's working with empirically based information and with the University of British Columbia. And so we've got a trauma journal coming up that I'm really excited about. So hopefully that'll be out sometime around the holidays or the first of the year in January. And so, and then I do a lot of different trainings, but people can always send me a message, and I always will respond to emails and such.
And trainings for whom?
So we're doing, I'm doing a couple of trainings for, again, we're working with some police reform. And so we're doing some of those trainings. And then I'm doing a few different trainings for individual groups. And so we're hoping to do something through our clinic starting in January. So we have a mailing list. If people want to get on the newsletter, they can stay tuned and wait and see kind of what our webinar series is coming out. I know you offer some amazing trainings for the listeners that haven't done that yet. Guys got some of the best work out there. So I always like take your trainings. There's good stuff out there. And then I also do consultation. So if people would like to do that, then
awesome. And so what is the best way for people to reach out to you? Is it the website?
The website, yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And again,
we're on all the social media platforms so they can find us.
Okay. So the website is Joelle Rabow Maletis. We'll have that linked up again at the show notes page. Joelle, you are really inspiring. And your story is to me is really inspiring. I mean, coming from dance and the whole somatic thing and how you were like, whoa, initially, but worked. I mean, I think that's really amazing. It's just, there's something so organic about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Before we go, book recommendation for our listeners, anything that's been inspiring you, or whether trauma related or not.
Yeah. There's a few different things I've been listening to. But I've started to re-listen to The Body Keeps the Score again, with Dr. Vanderkolk. I know he's got some new interviews out, and he's starting to reframe what he originally thought in that research so long ago. So I think that's still one of my go-tos. And then really, I've been listening to a lot of the post-traumatic growth work that's out there, and there's a few different researchers that are doing some work. So I think Body Keeps the Score is the one I'm listening to again right now.
Awesome. He doesn't read that himself, does he?
I don't know.
Okay. You said, okay. I couldn't imagine him taking the time to do that.
I think there's so many different versions of it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I'm listening to one that's not read by him.
All right. Joelle, awesome. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.